In the heavy stillness of a Dawson in 1623, a piercing scream shattered the calm and echoed through the marble halls of Topkapi Palace. It was not the moan of a wounded soldier, nor the howl of a defeated prisoner. It was the desperate cry of a girl barely 15 years old, Princess Fatma Sultan, daughter of the most powerful ruler on earth. Her voice cut through the corridors like shards of ice, and even the eunuchs at the doors shrank back in terror, forbidden to intervene in that sacred and secret moment. What happened that night was not a simple family misfortune, but the unveiling of the hidden costs that every daughter of a sultan was forced to pay, a price carved into flesh and soul, which official history tried to bury for 6 centuries. Those cries did not come from a battlefield wound, but from a ritual so secret and cruel that it broke the will before it broke the body, condemning these princesses to a life of shadows long before they crossed the threshold into adulthood. For more than 600 years, the Ottoman Empire preserved a marriage preparation system so dark that not even its worst enemies would have wished it on their own daughters. It was a protocol carefully erased from chronicles, camouflaged behind thick curtains and golden walls, and only brought back to light centuries later, thanks to documents discovered in Istanbul's hidden archives in 2019. All over the world, millions of girls, peasants, and noblewomen alike dreamed of the supposed glory of living as Ottoman princesses, wrapped in silk, jewels, and unquestioned obedience. But behind those glittering walls, there was not a paradise of luxury, but a nightmare so elegantly designed that many of these young women came to prefer death over marriage. And today, through this story, you and I will uncover together the truth that remained locked away for 600 years. Prepare yourself. What you are about to hear is not a charming legend, but a tale of horror carefully dressed up as imperial ceremony. Before we go on, I want to ask you something. If this story has already stirred something inside you, show your support with a simple gesture. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us which queen or princess' dark destiny you'd like us to explore in a future video. Maybe Marie Antoinette, Cleopatra, Anne Boleyn, another name you carry in your memory. Your choice will decide which secret, buried by time, we reveal next. Now come with me and discover why so many Ottoman princesses, born inside golden palaces, ended up choosing the cold peace of the grave over the fate that awaited them in marriage. The Ottoman Empire, immense like an endless sea, extended its shadow for more than 6 centuries. From 1299 until 1922, it was a power that dominated 3 continents, whose armies' echoes were heard from Vienna's walls to the burning deserts of Yemen. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the city, renamed Istanbul, became the pulsating heart of the empire, and Topkapi Palace its brightest jewel. Behind its gilded doors and perfumed courtyards, the destinies of nations and individuals were decided. In those secluded rooms, hidden behind carved latticework and labyrinthine passageways, the imperial court formed a world unto itself, inhabited by more than 800 women at its height. That closed universe, woven from silk and ambition, was a place where every breath was controlled and every gesture could mean elevation or ruin. From 1530 onward, when Suleiman the Magnificent granted his wife Khurram the title of Hoseki Sultan, the harem became not only a space of pleasure, but also a stage for conspiracies, alliances, and silent wars between women. The concubines, most of them Christian slaves, captured in faraway European lands, or acquired in North African markets, arrived at the seraglio full of hope. Their days revolved around music, embroidery, poetry, and protocols of obedience, all sustained by the illusion of attracting the Sultan's attention and transforming slavery into influence. Paradoxically, those young women torn from their homes often had more chances for advancement than the daughters born within the imperial family. The period known as the Sultanate of Women between 1533 and 1656 made clear how powerful female influence could be in the empire's political life. Figures like Kaiksim Sultan and Turhan Hadis Sultan ended up directing state affairs from the shadows, guiding councils, deciding on wars and shaping Ottoman history with a firm and visible hand. But while some of them climbed to power, the princesses of royal blood found themselves trapped in a much darker maze. They were pieces in a diplomatic game, living pledges used to secure alliances, stifle revolts, or guarantee the loyalty of mighty pashas. It was in this world that Princess Fatma Sultan was born in 1606, daughter of Sultan Ahmed, and the formidable Cakesaman, extraordinary woman, capable of ruling as if she were the sovereign himself, though always from behind the curtain. Fatma was raised among aromatic gardens and lessons in astronomy, surrounded by Arabic and Persian manuscripts, with scholars who praised her quick mind and chroniclers who recorded her beauty, but rarely her knowledge, neither her intelligence nor her mother's power could protect her from a destiny written from the day of her birth. She would be married off as a political token, whether she wished it or not. The man chosen for her was Damat Kara Mustafa Pasha, a veteran commander hardened in battles against Persia, 20 years older than her. Between them, there was no affection, no choice, and certainly no pity, only the cold arithmetic of imperial strategy. For him, this union was a step up in influence and prestige. For her, it was the opening chapter of a tragedy. From her earliest years, Fatma had shown herself to be an exceptional child. She spoke 4 languages fluently. Her Arabic and Persian calligraphy had the refinement of a poet's hand, and she possessed an insatiable curiosity for the motions of the heavens. Palace scholars saw in her a prodigy, able to discuss history, law, and geography with seasoned teachers. Yet all that brilliance was useless before the future silently awaiting her behind the harem's gates. Her life was never truly hers. The invisible agreements of the court dictated that her existence would serve as a bargaining chip in the empire's game of power. The decision eventually centered on Mustafa Pasha, the war commander of mature age. Their union was not forged in affection, but in calculation. He sought status and consolidation. She, still almost a child, was reduced to a sacrificial piece on the imperial chessboard. 3 months before the wedding, the dreaded preparation known as Turval and Mubarak began the so-called sacred education. This process, reserved exclusively for princesses, had no equivalent in any other culture of that era. It was the result of centuries of refinement and psychological control, designed to erase the pride of royal blood and reshape it into blind obedience. The woman overseeing this training was Gulnar Hatton, an elderly matron close to 60, chief of the harem and witness to the preparation of more than a dozen princesses. Under her unyielding supervision, Fatma was taken to the angelic dare, the bridal chamber, a room decorated with Persian carpets. In ebony panels, where every object reminded her of her role and her fate. From sunrise until midday, Fatma had to perform endless rituals of submission. She was required to learn 18 distinct forms of bowing positions for greetings, service, rest, and silent readiness to receive her husband. Even the simple act of walking became a regulated exercise. She practiced the yuru and the sis, measured steps, head inclined at a precise 30-degree angle, hands controlled so that they never rose above the level of her heart. With each movement, her innate dignity as a princess was stripped away and replaced by the posture of a perfectly obedient bride. The harshest discipline, however, targeted her speech. Her vocabulary was reduced to just 43 permitted words, phrases of thanks, acceptance, humble request, or apology. Any attempt at spontaneous expression, any hint of opinion, was met with punishment: forced fasting, isolation in cramped reflection cells, or humiliation before other women. The princess had to submit regularly to examinations before a council of women, and eunuchs presided over by Cakesam herself, who evaluated her obedience as if it were a commodity in a market. Then came the most disturbing phase: rehearsals of the wedding night, known as talim and girdik. In underground chambers of the palace, exact replicas of bridal rooms had been built, where the princess was confronted with wax mannequins' anatomical figures ordered from Venetian craftsmen. Under the cold eyes of instructors, Fatma was compelled to practice gestures and actions no young girl should be familiar with. Every reaction was carefully recorded in cryptic registers: her terror, her tears, her reluctance. Each sign of resistance brought more sessions, more pressure, more systematic conditioning. Gradually, the girl who had once admired the stars was transformed into a trained body, a domesticated spirit, a captive of a ritual designed to strip her identity away thread by thread. Fatma Sultan ceased to be the emperor's beloved daughter and became a student of submission. The education did not end with postures, steps, or forced silence. Fatma was dragged through a series of tests meant to break not only her body, but her inner world. Any hint of defiance, a proud look, an impatient sigh was severely punished. She could be subjected to long fasts that left her on the verge of collapse, shut into damp and dark reflection cells, or forced to repeat her rituals before the entire women's court, exposed and shamed like a rebellious servant. Alongside the physical discipline came a program of mental purification. Fatma was obligated to memorize dozens of passages from Ottoman and Persian texts on marital obedience, which she had to recite aloud before concubines and eunuchs acting as judges. Excerpts from Al-Ghazal's Nisayat al-Mulk and fragments from the Akhlaq-i Mohsini were imposed upon her verses praising submission, self-sacrifice, and total obedience to one's husband as supreme virtues. The same girl who had once recited verses of love and astronomy now repeated, with a broken voice, lines that erased her own will. Even prayer became a chain around her neck. 5 times a day at strictly fixed hours, Fatma was required to say special prayers composed by the empire's ulama. These were not simple expressions of personal faith, but carefully crafted invocations with a single purpose: to dissolve her individuality and exalt unconditional surrender to her husband. The position she had to adopt during prayer blended religious devotion with gestures tied to her future marital duties, turning the sacred act into another tool of control. Yet the humiliations went even further. Twice weekly, in full view of the women's court, Fatma had to personally serve her father's favorite concubines. She washed them, combed their hair, fed them by hand, and dressed them for their nights with the Sultan. This ritual had one objective: to crush the last remnant of pride in the princess, forcing her to accept that even her father's lovers held a claim to her service. Chroniclers recount that on several occasions, Fatma broke down in sobs as she adjusted the clothing of those women destined for the imperial bed. A week before the wedding, the regime became even more merciless. The princess was transferred to the Galen KK, the bride's pavilion, an isolated building where no sound from the outside world could reach her. Every detail of her routine was dictated: her food, pomegranates, honey, almonds, goats, milk, and spices from Yemen; her baths, her rest. Her daily ablutions were carried out under the gaze of purification specialists, using oils scented with valerian, poppy, and orange blossom. These mixtures, prepared by alchemists trained in Cordoba and Samarkand, contained secret substances that calmed, subdued, and in some cases produced a sense of total inner abandonment. The pavilion walls were covered with silk tapestries showing scenes of exemplary wives from Islamic and Ottoman tradition. Obedient, fertile, submissive women promised paradise. To reinforce the message, Venetian mirrors were placed at strategic points so that Fatma was forced to see herself constantly while she trained, as if she were under the scrutiny of her own reflection. This practice, originally a Sufi technique of self-observation called muraqabah, was twisted here into a psychological weapon, a way of making the princess police even her own thoughts. In that seclusion, Fatma finally understood that she no longer had control over anything. Her body, her voice, and even her inner life had been shaped into tools of obedience. The preparation had fully achieved its aim, not just to tame the princess, but to erase the curious, brilliant young girl who had once dreamed of the stars. The long-awaited day arrived on March 15, 1623. From the first light of morning, Istanbul pulsed with excitement. Streets filled with crowds, music, and burning incense, while inside Topkapi Palace banquets were laid out on gold trays. There were dances brought from Persia and Al-Andalus, songs performed by the finest musicians of the empire, and displays of skill by warriors and acrobats in honor of the Sultan. To the people, the celebration seemed like a festival gifted from the heavens. For the princess, it was the prologue to a sentence. Chroniclers tell us that, while the guests laughed and drank, Fatma remained quiet, with dry lips and empty eyes. Palace doctors, observing her closely, described symptoms we would now recognize as severe anxiety: trembling, cold sweats despite the cool March air, a total loss of appetite, and labored breathing that made them fear she might collapse at any moment. The splendor of the public festivities contrasted brutally with the private terror swelling inside her. Once the last toast had been made and the lay guests had departed, the most feared procession began. Fatma was escorted to the bridal pavilion, a structure built in the private gardens following architectural schemes dating back to Mehmed II. It was an octagonal building with 3 levels, each devoted to a different stage: purification, surrender, and consummation. The design was intentional. Every space intensified the princess's vulnerability and turned the event into a complete act of domination. The first level, Taha Kadi, was for cleansing. There, the young woman underwent ritual baths lasting hours. Carrara marble basins, water perfumed with damask rose, jasmine, sandalwood, and Somali ambergris caressed her skin. Alchemists spread ointments prepared with diluted opium, mandrake extract, and other secret components to bring about serenity and resignation. Doctors described the resulting condition as a kind of ecstasy of duty, where the body yielded while the soul screamed in silence. The second level, Teslim Kadi, was the floor of surrender. Their Fatma was dressed in a bridal robe of white silk, embroidered with gold thread and pearls from the Gulf. At first glance, it was simply a magnificent gown. In reality, it was engineered with hidden clasps and inner laces that made it easy to immobilize the wearer's limbs. The heavy crown restricted her movements. Anklets and bracelets subtly limited her gestures, and thick-soled shoes hindered any attempt to run. The sumptuous dress was, in fact, a richly decorated cage. While Fatma was being transformed into a living symbol of obedience, her future husband, Kara Mustafa Pasha, was undergoing very different preparations. Surrounded by advisors and veterans, he received instructions on how to subdue an imperial princess, psychological tactics, phrases designed to belittle, and methods of physical control. The aim was to ensure that in that relationship there would be no room for hesitation or resistance. Finally came the climb to the third level, the Sefaf Kadi, the Chamber of Consummation. Its walls were hung with tapestries showing military victories, conquered cities, captive princesses, and defeated enemies. The choice of images was deliberate, drawing a parallel between triumph on the battlefield and triumph in the wedding chamber. The furniture, made by artisans experienced in instruments of bodily control, included beds with hidden rope mechanisms, cushions soaked in sedative oils, and dim lighting that turned the room into a stage designed to crush the will. In that charged atmosphere, Fatma faced the night she had dreaded for months. The girl, sustained only by ragged breaths, became the living symbol of a political agreement. Although official accounts would later celebrate the wedding as a success for the dynasty, behind the closed doors of that room a catastrophe was unfolding that would mark her soul forever. When the doors of the Sefaf Kadi closed on the bridal procession, Fatma was left alone with her husband. Medical notes from the period describe what followed as a complete breakdown. The young woman who had withstood months of discipline and humiliation could no longer think coherently. Her body shook uncontrollably, her voice shrank to a barely audible whisper, and her eyes stared at some distant, invisible point. Imperial physicians called this state sakmai, tam total shock. Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man used to storming fortresses, had been instructed to enforce his authority. At first, he interpreted the princess's reaction as stubbornness, as pride that needed to be crushed. He applied the techniques he had been taught: menacing words, displays of dominance, calculated physical contact. But what he encountered was not defiance. It was emptiness. Fatma was no longer fighting. She was absent. Her mind had fled somewhere deep inside, leaving behind a body acting only on reflex. When the marriage was finally consummated, after hours of failed attempts, hidden observers described the event as deeply traumatic for both. In writings encoded in Persian, they mention internal bleeding, repeated fainting, and what doctors called rusak messi, the soul departing. From that night onward, Fatma was never again the girl she had been. In the days that followed, her behavior terrified even the strictest women of the harem. She developed a form of selective mutism. She spoke only in whispers, and only when someone addressed her directly. She refused food to such an extent that they had to feed her by force. Sudden crying spells appeared without clear cause and could go on for hours. Worst of all, she developed what chroniclers described as a disease of fear. The mere presence of any man, even eunuchs who had long served her, was enough to trigger panic, rapid breathing, streams of sweat, and abrupt fainting. The court physicians diagnosed a condition they called virginal melancholy. which they noted as common among princesses after their wedding night. In modern language, we would speak of deep psychological trauma, a wound beyond the reach of simple remedies. They tried treatments with medicinal plants, music therapy, and Sufi spiritual practices, but nothing restored the brightness she once had. The brilliant young woman who debated with scholars, the curious girl who loved the constellations and poetry, disappeared forever. In her place remained a quiet, distant, mechanical figure. Her books stayed shut. Her instruments for music fell silent, and the gardens she once roamed were left untended. The daughter of the most powerful sultan had become a shadow of what she might have been. Her marriage to Mustafa Pasha turned into an empty routine. There were children, formal appearances, and a facade of normal life, but behind closed doors, coldness and silence ruled. According to later testimonies, the Pasha himself sought refuge in new campaigns and in opium. Trying in vain to drown the guilt of having been part of a ritual that destroyed the princess, Fatma lived another 29 years after that night, reduced to a ceremonial figure, a reluctant mother, and a wife without a voice. Her death in 1652 was officially attributed to brain fever and coincided exactly with her wedding anniversary. For many at court, this timing was no accident. On that date, they said, the weight of memory finally closed over her completely. Fatma Sultan's story was not an isolated exception, but one thread in a pattern repeated over generations. Palace documents rescued centuries later from oblivion show that dozens of Ottoman princesses suffered similar fates. Some fell into complete silence, others tried to escape through suicide or madness, and a few were simply erased from official records, as if they had never been born. The imperial machine, so precise in its rules and ceremonies, was equally efficient at deleting inconvenient lives and disguising them with elegant phrases and carefully crafted chronicles. Recently translated texts speak of princesses who went so far as to fake their own deaths to avoid a second marriage, of others who invented secret codes to communicate with sisters trapped in the same system, the handful who, with unimaginable courage, dared to ask the Sultan himself for a divorce, confronting a structure that seemed immovable. These accounts, hidden for centuries in cellars and forbidden archives, revealed that even in the darkest corners of history, there were always sparks of female resistance. Fatma's tragedy, and that of so many like her, reveals a bitter truth. Absolute power does not necessarily shield those closest to it. On the contrary, it often devours them first. While the outside world pictured Ottoman princesses surrounded by luxury and authority, the reality was an invisible chain of obligations, shaped with the precision of a mechanism that sacrificed lives to keep alliances and institutions standing. Seen from today, we can understand that the imperial harem was not just a space of silks and intrigues, but also a theater of forced silence and smothered sobs. The tales we were told as children, those supposed palace fairy stories, were, in many cases, political narratives that fed on the suffering of the very women they adorned in legend. And so a question becomes inevitable. How many more secrets lie waiting in the archives of old palaces? What other rituals, equally dark, were practiced in European courts, in Russia, in China? What was the true cost paid by the women destined to uphold the splendor of their dynasties? If Fatma's story has touched you, don't hesitate to stay with us for the next revelations. Subscribe, share this video with those who deserve to know what lies behind the fairy tales, and leave in the comments the name of the queen or princess whose destiny you'd like to see uncovered. Perhaps a Russian Tsarina feared even by her mother, a Chinese empress subjected to macabre customs, or a daughter of European kings used as a living pledge of loyalty. Because only by confronting these hidden truths can we tear away history, mask, and finally listen to the silenced voices of those sacrificed in the name of power.